Police searched his home 3 times. They knew his name for 22 years. They never touched him. His name was Arthur Leigh Allen, a former elementary school teacher from Vallejo, California. He wore a wristwatch with a brand name printed on its face, Zodiac, and its logo was a circle with a cross drawn through it. The exact symbol a serial killer was signing at the bottom of letters mailed to San Francisco newspapers. When detectives finally stood in his living room in 1971 and told him why they had come, Allen looked at them and mentioned the knives in his car before they ever asked about knives. There was still blood on one of the blades. He said it came from a chicken. He was the only suspect ever served with a search warrant in the case. He was identified decades later by a surviving victim who picked his photograph out of a lineup and said the face was the closest thing to the man who shot him. A friend swore under police questioning that Allen had described the murders before they happened. The couples, the flashlight taped to the gun barrel, even the name he would use, Zodiac. And yet in 2002, when a forensic lab finally pulled a partial DNA profile from the back of a stamp the killer had licked, the profile did not match Arthur Leigh Allen. The fingerprints didn't match. The handwriting didn't match. The one man everything pointed to was excluded by the only physical evidence that ever existed. So the question this case forces you to hold for the next hour, and for the rest of your life if you're not careful, is not simply who the Zodiac was. It is this: how does a man accumulate that much circumstantial evidence against him and still walk free until the day he dies? Either the police spent 22 years watching the right man and could never prove it, or the entire Bay Area spent half a century staring at the wrong face while the real killer read about it in the newspaper. Both answers are terrifying. Only one of them is true. And by the end of this case, you will understand why. 57 years later, the state of California still cannot tell you which. Here is what can be verified. Between December 1968 and October 1969, a single killer attacked 7 people in Northern California. 5 died. 2 survived, and both survivors described the same man. He shot teenagers on lovers' lanes. He stabbed a couple in daylight while wearing an executioner's hood he had sewn himself, with his symbol stitched onto the chest. He shot a cab driver in the head in one of San Francisco's wealthiest neighborhoods and walked away, pausing, witnesses said calmly, to tear off a piece of the dying man's shirt. Then he did something no American serial killer had done before with such deliberate theatricality. He opened a correspondence with the public. Letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald. Ciphers, he claimed, contained his identity, threats to shoot children as they stepped off a school bus. A running scoreboard in which the number of victims he claimed climbed to 37, more than 5 times the number police could ever confirm. He named himself in his 4th letter, in a sentence that became one of the most chilling opening lines in criminal history. This is the Zodiac speaking. Then, in 1974, the letter stopped. No arrest, no body, no confession. Silence. The file never closed. It only grew. A 1986 book by a political cartoonist who had been sitting in the Chronicle newsroom when the first letter arrived. A 2007 David Fincher film built from that obsession. In December 2020, 51 years after it was mailed, a team of amateur codebreakers on 3 continents finally cracked the killer's 340-character cipher. And inside it, the Zodiac was still taunting. He was not afraid of the gas chamber. And in October 2024, Netflix released a 3-part documentary in which 2 siblings, David and Connie Seawater, made an allegation that reframed the entire case. Arthur Leigh Allen had been like a father to them in the 1960s. They say he drugged them as children. They say he took them on weekend trips, and that years later, retracing those trips, they realized they had been to the murder sites before the murders. They say he confessed. If they are right, the police had their man from the beginning, and the proof died with him in 1992. If they are wrong, the most famous suspect in American criminal history was an innocent man, a deeply damaged, dangerous, guilty of other things man, but innocent of this, and the Zodiac was never even questioned. This is the full case. First victim to last unanswered question, every cipher, every search warrant, every mistake. And it begins, as it must, not with the killer, but with the place that made him possible. The San Francisco Bay Area at the end of 1968 was a region living in 2 different decades at once. 40 miles northeast of the Summer of Love, the city of Vallejo belonged to the older one. It was a navy town, built around the Mare Island shipyard, populated by machinists, welders, sailors' families, people who worked with their hands and locked their doors out of habit rather than fear. Teenagers there did what teenagers in every American small city did in 1968. On weekend nights, they drove out to the quiet roads at the edge of town, parked under the dark, and were alone together. Lake Herman Road was one of those places, a 2-lane strip of asphalt running east out of Vallejo through empty ranchland, unlit, unpatrolled, known to every kid in town and to no one else. The geography matters because the Zodiac's first documented act was not a murder. It was a selection. He chose a hunting ground where victims delivered themselves at night, in pairs, far from witnesses. That choice tells you the first verifiable fact about his mind. Before anyone died, he had already done the reconnaissance. Criminal profiling as a discipline barely existed in 1968. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was still 4 years away. But the profile the Zodiac left of himself, in his crimes, and above all in his letters, has been studied for over half a century, and its outlines are consistent. This was an organized offender with a disorganized core. The attacks were planned. He brought his own light source, pre-cut lengths of rope, a hood sewn in advance, multiple weapons for multiple crimes. The letters were the opposite, riddled with spelling errors that analysts still argue were genuine or staged, swinging between icy procedural detail and childish gloating. He craved control over the narrative more than control over the victims. Most serial killers hide from the press. The Zodiac assigned himself a name, a costume, and a logo. He branded himself decades before that word meant anything, and then threatened newspapers with more murders if they refused to publish him on the front page. Forensic psychiatrists who have reviewed the letters describe a man of above-average intelligence with a grandiose, wounded ego. Someone whose life was small, whose talents had been rejected or wasted, and who had discovered exactly one arena in which he could make the most powerful institutions in California obey him. Now, hold that profile in one hand and look at Arthur Leigh Allen with the other. Allen was born on December 18, 1933, in Honolulu. The son of a decorated Navy officer, a father remembered as rigid and demanding, a man Allen spent his life failing to satisfy. The family settled in Vallejo, in a modest house on Fresno Street, and Allen never truly left it. He was physically imposing, over 6 feet tall, more than 200 pounds, a strong swimmer and diver who had once dreamed of competing seriously. He attended Vallejo High School and later earned a degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He joined the Navy like his father and was discharged. He became an elementary school teacher, a job that gave a man of his intelligence status, respect, and daily access to children. Those who knew him described two different people wearing the same face. Neighbors saw a heavy-set, soft-spoken bachelor who loved chipmunks and skin diving, who was generous with local kids, who still lived in his mother's basement into middle age. The other, Arthur Leigh Allen, was the one the school district discovered in March 1968, when he was fired from his teaching position in Calaveras County for sexually molesting students. That date deserves to be underlined because the entire circumstantial case begins with it. March 1968. Allen loses his career, his identity, and whatever remained of his standing in his father's eyes. The collapse profilers look for, the stressor that precedes a first kill. 9 months later, two teenagers are shot dead on Lake Herman Road, 10 minutes from his house. And according to one man's sworn account, Allen had already announced what was coming. Donald Cheney, a former friend, would later tell police about a conversation he placed around New Year's of 1969, Allen musing about hunting people, about killing couples in lovers' lanes, about taping a flashlight to the barrel of a gun so he could aim in the dark, about taunting police with letters, and about a name he liked. He would call himself Zodiac, the problem, and this case is built entirely out of problems like this, is that Cheney did not report that conversation in 1969. He reported it in 1971, 2 years and 5 bodies later, after the name Zodiac was printed in every newspaper in America. Investigators had to decide whether they were hearing a memory or a reconstruction. It is the first of many moments where the evidence against Allen is either devastating or worthless, depending on a single human variable no lab can test. His life after 1968 only deepened the pattern. He drifted between jobs, a refinery, a hardware store, odd work, a trained teacher with a college degree sinking steadily below his own abilities, exactly the trajectory of resentment the letters seem to radiate. He was ambidextrous, a detail that would later be raised whenever his handwriting failed to match the killer's. He owned guns, he owned knives, he hunted. He was a skilled amateur codemaker who, former students recalled, had taught children how to construct simple ciphers, and on his wrist, given to him, he said, by his mother, was the watch, a Zodiac sea wolf, the brand's crossed circle emblem printed at the center of the dial, the same mark that would soon be carved into the door of a victim's car and inked at the bottom of letters that terrorized a state. None of it, on its own, means anything. A watch is a watch. A fired teacher is a tragedy, not a verdict. Tens of thousands of Bay Area men owned guns and knives in 1968. That is precisely what makes this case the purest laboratory in true crime. Every element is circumstantial, every element is explainable, and the elements refuse to stop accumulating. The question investigators would wrestle with for 2 decades is the question you should carry into the next hour. At what point does coincidence collapse under its own weight? Because on the night of December 20th, 1968, the theoretical part of this story ends. A brown Rambler station wagon pulls off Lake Herman Road and parks in a gravel turnout by a gate. Inside are David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16. It is her first date. In roughly 20 minutes, another car will roll into the turnout behind them and stop. and what happens in the beam of its headlights will open the most famous unsolved murder file in the history of California. December 20th, 1968. A Friday, 5 days before Christmas. David Faraday was 17, an Eagle Scout, a varsity wrestler, the kind of boy parents trusted on sight. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, quiet, careful, and this was the first real date of her life. She had told her parents they were going to a Christmas concert at her school. Instead, like every other teenager in Vallejo, they ended up on Lake Herman Road, in the gravel turnout by the pump station gate, in David's mother's Rambler, sometime after 10 at night. The temperature outside was near freezing. The engine was off. What happened next has been reconstructed from physical evidence alone, because the only witnesses were the two people who died. Around 11 p.m., another vehicle entered the turnout and parked beside or behind the Rambler. Investigators believe the driver got out and at some point ordered or frightened the teenagers out of the car, possibly by firing a round through the rear window and another into the rear wheel housing, herding them. David made it barely a step. He was shot once, behind the left ear, at contact range or close to it, and collapsed beside the right rear wheel. Betty Lou ran. She got 28 feet, measured later to the inch, before 5 rounds struck her in the back, grouped tightly on the right side. A .22 caliber semi-automatic, firing Winchester Western Super X ammunition. The grouping matters. Hitting a fleeing target 5 times at night in the back in a tight pattern is not panic shooting. It is marksmanship. And then the killer did something that would become his signature before he had a name. Nothing. He took nothing. No wallet, no purse, no assault, no contact with the bodies. He simply got back into his car and drove toward Vallejo. At approximately 11:14 p.m., a woman named Stella Borges drove past the turnout, saw the bodies in her headlights, and flagged down a police car in Benicia. The victims had been dead for minutes. The Solano County Sheriff's Office worked the case the only way 1968 logic allowed, as something personal, a jealous rival, a jilted boyfriend, someone who knew these specific kids. Detectives interviewed classmates and ex-boyfriends for months and found nothing, because they were asking the only reasonable question, and the answer to this case was not reasonable. The idea that a stranger had killed 2 random teenagers for the act itself, that the victims were interchangeable, was a category of crime American police barely had a vocabulary for. The file went cold in weeks. It would stay cold for 6 months and 12 days until the killer himself called the police to claim it, July 4th, 1969. Independence Day night in Vallejo, fireworks over the water, traffic on Springs Road, the city loud enough to swallow gunshots. Darlene Ferrin was 22, a waitress at Terry's restaurant, married, the mother of an infant daughter, sociable, popular, a young woman with a wide and complicated circle of friends that would keep detectives busy for years. Michael Mageau was 19. Just before midnight, the two of them drove into the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, 4 miles from Lake Herman Road, and stopped. The lot was dark and briefly empty. A car pulled in behind them and parked. Sat there, drove off. Roughly 10 minutes later, around 12:10 a.m., it returned, and this time it stopped directly behind Darlene's Corvair. A man got out carrying what Mageau took for a flashlight, walked to the passenger side as if he were a police officer approaching a stop, raised the light into their eyes, and fired. 5 shots through the window with a 9mm Luger. Darlene was hit multiple times. Majot took rounds in the face, neck and chest. The man walked back toward his car and then heard Majot screaming. He turned around, came back and shot each of them twice more, deliberately. Then he drove out of the lot at speed. Darlene Ferrin was pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. Michael Majot, against every medical expectation, survived and gave police their first description of the man. White, heavy-set, beefy but not fat, around 5'8" or taller, short, curly, light brown hair, 26 to 30 years old. Remember every word of that description. It will come back at the end of this case 22 years later in a photo lineup, and it will point at a face. But the shooter wasn't finished with the night. At 12:40 a.m., 2 minutes after Darlene was declared dead, the switchboard at the Vallejo Police Department lit up. The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, picked up and heard a male voice. Calm, flat, unhurried, as if reading from a card. He wanted to report a double murder. He gave the location, a mile east on Columbus Parkway, the public park. He said the victims had been shot with a 9mm Luger. And then he said the sentence that fused 2 case files into one and announced the existence of a serial killer. I also killed those kids last year. He closed with a single word, goodbye, dragged out, Slover later said in a taunting, deepening drawl. The call was traced to a payphone at a gas station at Springs Road and Tuolumne Street. Officers reached it within minutes. The receiver was hanging there, still off the hook. The phone booth stood a few blocks from Darlene Ferrin's home, and only a few minutes' drive from the Vallejo Police Department itself. He hadn't fled the city after killing. He had driven deeper into it, parked within sight of the people hunting him, and dialed. Understand what that call was, because it was not a confession. It was a claim of ownership. Nothing in it helped him. Everything in it was risk. He surrendered the only advantage a murderer has, anonymity of authorship, in exchange for something he evidently valued more, credit. The Lake Herman Road file had gone cold, and he could not tolerate that his work had stopped being discussed. Forensic psychologists point to that phone call as the moment the Zodiac's true motive surfaced. The shootings were the raw material. The audience was the point. 27 days later, he proved it. On July 31, 1969, 3 envelopes moved through the Bay Area mail, addressed in the same felt pen printing to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each contained a handwritten letter opening with the words, "Dear Editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman." Each proved the claim the only way that mattered, with details never released to the public, the brand of ammunition, the position of the bodies, the number of shots, what Darlene and Michael had been wearing. This was not a crank writing a headline. This was the shooter, and each letter came with something no American newspaper had ever received. 1/3 of a cipher. 408 characters of invented symbols, zodiac signs, weather marks, reversed letters, cut into 3 pieces so that no single paper had the whole. The instructions were explicit. Print your portion on the front page by Friday afternoon, or I will go on a kill rampage, a weekend of murder, a dozen random victims picked off at night. At the bottom of each page, where a signature should have been, was a symbol instead, a circle with a cross through it, a gun sight. The face of a Zodiac watch. The papers printed it, and then something happened that the killer clearly did not plan for. He had implied the cipher contained his identity, that cracking it would name him. Naval intelligence tried. The FBI's cryptanalysis unit tried, and on August 8th, 1 week after publication, the 408 was broken not by any of them, but by a high school teacher named Donald Harden and his wife Betty, working at their kitchen table in Salinas. Betty's insight was psychological, not mathematical. "Assume the message begins with the word I," she said, "because a man like this talks about himself." She was right. The decrypted text remains one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history, a manifesto stating that he liked killing people because it was so much fun, that it was more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all, and that the people he killed would become his slaves in the afterlife, and at the very point where his identity was promised, a final taunt. He would not give his name because it would slow down or stop his collecting of slaves. The last 18 characters of the cipher resolved into gibberish that has never been convincingly explained. The promise had been bait. The Bay Area had done exactly what he wanted, put his words on every front page, and received nothing back but a self-portrait. Even before the Hardens cracked it, the Vallejo police chief had publicly challenged the letter writer to prove authorship with more facts. The killer obliged instantly. On August 4th, a fourth letter arrived at the Examiner, and its opening line gave the monster his permanent name: "Dear Editor." This is the Zodiac speaking. No one gave him that name. No detective, no headline writer. He named himself the way a brand names itself, and then filled 2 pages with corrections to the newspaper coverage of his own crimes. Irritated, precise, the tone of a craftsman reviewing a sloppy write-up of his work. Police would not find the shooter, he added, until they stumbled across him. Step back and look at what existed by the second week of August 1969, because this is the shape of everything that follows. 3 dead, 1 survivor, 2 crime scenes connected by the killer's own voice and pen, a self-assigned name, a logo, a proven willingness to murder strangers of both sexes, and a communication strategy that had just successfully commandeered the front pages of Northern California. Multiple jurisdictions, Solano County, Vallejo PD, holding pieces of a case that respected no jurisdictional line. In an era with no shared databases, no task force protocol, no word yet for what they were dealing with. The term serial killer would not enter common use for another decade. The men hunting the Zodiac in 1969 were, in a real sense, hunting a category of criminal that officially did not exist. And in Vallejo, 10 minutes from Lake Herman Road, a few minutes from that payphone, lived a fired schoolteacher with a Zodiac watch on his wrist, a trained marksman, a code maker, a man whose friend would later swear had described flashlight-aimed shootings of couples, and the name Zodiac months before any of it happened. In August 1969, no one had said his name to police yet. That was 2 years away. What came next was not a letter. 58 days after the 408 cipher hit the newsstands on a warm Saturday afternoon at a lake in Napa County, a young couple on a picnic looked up from their blanket and saw a figure watching them from the tree line. When he stepped out of the trees, he was wearing a black executioner's hood, and on his chest, sewn in white, was the crossed circle. It is the only time in the entire case that the Zodiac let living witnesses study him. It is the crime that turned a regional story into a national nightmare, and it left, carved into the door of a car, the closest thing to a diary entry the killer ever wrote. September 27th, 1969. Lake Berryessa, Napa County, 30 miles north of Vallejo, a reservoir ringed by oak-covered hills, nearly empty on a hot Saturday afternoon. Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were students at Pacific Union College, friends who had once dated, spending a last afternoon together before Cecilia moved away. Around 4 p.m., they spread a blanket on a small peninsula, jutting into the water, on the grass under the trees. It was broad daylight. That detail alone breaks the pattern of everything the killer had done before, and pattern breaking, in this case, is always deliberate. Cecilia saw him first, a man standing in the tree line about 50 yards away watching. He disappeared behind the trees. When he emerged again, walking toward them, he had transformed. He was wearing a black hood, not a mask, a constructed garment, sewn at home, square-topped like a headsman's, with clip-on sunglasses fixed over the eye-holes. It draped over his chest, and on the chest panel, embroidered in white thread, was the crossed circle. He carried a semi-automatic pistol in one hand. From his belt hung a long knife in a wooden sheath and pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. Everything about the costume answers one question and raises a worse one. It concealed his face, yes, but a bandana conceals a face. This was regalia. He had spent hours making it. The Zodiac had come to be seen as the Zodiac. What followed, Hartnell would recount with astonishing composure from his hospital bed. The man's voice was calm. He said he was an escaped convict from Deer Lodge, Montana, that he had killed a guard, that he needed their car and money to get to Mexico. Hartnell, a sociology student, decided the safest strategy was cooperation. He offered his wallet, offered help, kept him talking. The man's answers were flat and strange. When Hartnell said he thought the gun might be empty, the man wordlessly displayed the magazine. He ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands with the clothesline, then tied hers, then checked her work on Brian and re-tied it tighter. The robbery story was already dissolving. He had barely glanced at the wallet. Then he said the sentence that ended the performance. "I'm going to have to stab you people." Hartnell asked to be first, so he wouldn't have to watch Cecilia die. The man knelt and attacked him with the knife, then turned to Cecilia. The assault was frenzied where everything before it had been procedural. Then he walked calmly back up the trail, and at the top of the trail he stopped at Hartnell's white Carmen Ghia, took out a black felt-tip pen and wrote on the passenger door, the crossed circle symbol. Beneath it, a list: Vallejo, 12-20-68, 7-4-69, Sept 27-69, 6:30, by knife. A ledger. He had signed the crime scene with his complete works, dated like an artist's catalogue. Then, replicating the Blue Rock Springs playbook to the minute, he drove to downtown Napa and called the police department from a payphone at a car wash on Main Street. "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. I'm the one that did it." Officers found the receiver dangling. On it, a palm print. Still, half a century later, matched to no one. He was wrong about the double murder, and the error cost him. Fishermen across the cove had heard screaming. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later without regaining sustained consciousness. But Brian Hartnell survived, the second living witness, and his testimony gave investigators their most granular portrait of the killer. The pressed, dark clothing, the careful knots, the flat affect, the height and heavy build, a description consistent point by point with what Michael Mageau had gasped out in July. 2 survivors now, same build, same calm, same man, 14 days later, he changed everything again. October 11th, 1969, San Francisco. Paul Stine, 29, was a doctoral student in English at San Francisco State, driving a yellow cab on a Saturday night to support his wife. At approximately 9:45 p.m., he picked up a fare downtown, destination Washington and Maple, in Presidio Heights, one of the wealthiest, quietest neighborhoods in the city. The cab stopped 1 block past the requested corner at Washington and Cherry. There, the passenger raised a 9mm and shot Stine once in the head at contact range. Then, unhurried, he took Stine's wallet and the keys and tore away a section of the dead man's shirt tail. Across the street, 3 teenagers watched the whole thing from a second-floor window, watched the man wipe down the door of the cab casually, like someone cleaning up after a spill, and phoned the police while he was still standing there. This is the moment the hunt came closer to the Zodiac than it ever would again, and the moment it broke. The teenagers described the shooter: a white male, stocky, with glasses and a crew cut. But somewhere between the call and the radio, the dispatch went out describing the suspect as a black male. Minutes later, Officer Donald Fook, patrolling the area, passed a stocky white man with glasses walking east on Jackson Street toward the Presidio, walking, not running, from the direction of the murder. Because the man didn't match the broadcast description, Fook did not stop him. By the time the description was corrected, the man had melted into the darkness of the park. Whether Fook passed the Zodiac that night has been debated for decades. Fook himself came to believe he had. If so, the most wanted man in California walked past a police cruiser within minutes of a murder, and the radio itself had provided his camouflage. To the SFPD, Stine's death initially read as a robbery gone wrong. Cab drivers were being robbed all over the city. That interpretation lasted 3 days. On October 13th, an envelope arrived at the Chronicle. "This is the Zodiac speaking. I'm the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington St. and Maplesant last night." Folded inside was proof no crank could fake, a torn swatch of grey and white striped cloth soaked in blood. It matched Paul Stine's shirt exactly. The trophy had been converted into a credential. He had killed in a 4th jurisdiction, escalated from a lonely road to the heart of a major city, from teenagers to a working adult male, proving the victim pool was everyone. And then he aimed his pen at the deepest fear available. The letter's closing paragraph: "School children make nice targets." He thought he would wipe out a school bus some morning, shoot out the front tire, and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The effect on Northern California cannot be overstated. Police cars shadowed school buses on their morning routes, aircraft patrolled above them, parents drove children to school in convoys. In Napa, in Vallejo, in San Francisco, the school bus threat did what all terrorism is engineered to do. It converted 5 murders into a hostage situation with several million hostages. And the Zodiac, watching the panic he had authored, kept writing. In the weeks that followed came the 7-page letter demanding people wear Zodiac buttons, the 340-character cipher that would defeat cryptanalysts for 51 years, a greeting card claiming 8 victims, and the bizarre midnight theater of the Jim Dunbar television show, when a caller claiming to be the Zodiac, almost certainly a hoaxer, investigators concluded, demanded on live TV to speak with celebrity attorney Melvin Belli, while much of the Bay Area watched at dawn. Real or not, the broadcast proved the transformation was complete. The Zodiac was no longer a criminal being covered by the media. He was a media phenomenon that occasionally committed crimes, but the forensic reality, the one that matters for everything ahead, is this: Paul Stine was the last murder ever definitively attributed to the Zodiac. Confirmed body count, 5 dead, 2 survivors. The letters would claim 10, then 17, then a scoreboard finally reaching 37, claims that sent detectives chasing every unsolved killing in California, from a 1966 stabbing in Riverside to the 1970 disappearance of Donna Lass at Lake Tahoe, cases that remain suspected but unproven Zodiac crimes to this day. Whether the count was inflation, delusion, or truth remains one of the case's open wounds. What is documented is that after October 1969, the confirmed killing, stopped, and the writing became the whole crime. He mailed bomb diagrams. He mailed a Halloween card to Chronicle reporter Paul Avery with the words, "You ache to know my name." The correspondence sputtered on until 1974, closing with a letter that ended in a chilling piece of accounting: "Me, at 37, SFPD, 0, and then silence. The most theatrical killer in American history simply stopped talking, which left the investigators alone with the paper, and the paper was a catastrophe. By the early 1970s, the case sprawled across at least 4 jurisdictions: Solano County, Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco, plus the FBI. In an era when files were cardboard, coordination was a telephone call, and each department guarded its own theory. Some 2,500 suspects would eventually pass through the files. Tips arrived by the thousand, each one requiring hours to eliminate. The physical evidence was thin and cursed: bullets and casings from 2 different guns, a palm print on a payphone, latent fingerprints on the Stine cab, including some in blood, that matched no one, and handwriting, reams of it, the killer's felt-tip printing, which document examiners treated as the gold standard for elimination. To be the Zodiac, a suspect had to write like him. Hold on to that assumption. It eliminated hundreds of men. It may have eliminated the wrong one, because in the summer of 1971, 2 years after the last confirmed murder, a man walked into the Manhattan Beach office of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and said he needed to talk about a friend of his. A friend up in Vallejo who had once described in detail and in advance exactly how a man might kill couples on lovers' lanes with a flashlight taped to his gun, write taunting letters to the police, and call himself Zodiac. The friend's name was Arthur Leigh Allen. The tip was forwarded north to Vallejo PD, where it landed on the desk of Detective John Lynch. And with that, the 2 halves of this story, the Phantom and the schoolteacher, finally collide. What the investigators did next, what they found in a trailer in Santa Rosa and a basement on Fresno Street, and the interview in which Allen mentioned bloody knives before anyone asked him a single question, that is where this case stops being a mystery about a killer and becomes a mystery about proof. The tip that reached Vallejo in the summer of 1971 came with a name attached to it twice. Donald Cheney, the man who walked into the Manhattan Beach Sheriff's Station, had known Arthur Leigh Allen for years, and what he described was not a suspicion. It was, if true, a blueprint delivered in advance. Sometime around the beginning of 1969, Cheney placed it on or near New Year's Day. Allen had allegedly laid out a fantasy in conversation, hunting human beings, targeting couples in lovers' lane spots, attaching a small flashlight to the barrel of a gun to aim it in darkness, sending letters to the police to mock them, and a name he liked the sound of for such a man: Zodiac. Cheney even recalled Allen referencing a short story he considered the finest thing ever written. Richard Connell's The Most Dangerous Game, the tale of an aristocrat who hunts men on a private island because man is the most dangerous animal. 9 months after that alleged conversation, the decrypted 408 cipher declared, in the killer's own words, that man is the most dangerous animal of all. If Cheney's memory was accurate, the case was over. Nobody innocently predicts a serial killer's methodology, signature, and pseudonym months before the crimes. But the timing gutted it. Cheney came forward in 1971, when every element he described had been in the newspapers for 2 years. There was no way to prove the conversation predated the crimes rather than the coverage. Worse, Cheney and Allen had fallen out. Cheney said Allen had made an improper advance toward his young daughter, which handed any defense attorney a motive for fabrication. Investigators were left holding a statement that was either the single most important piece of evidence in the case or worthless. It could not be both, and it could not be tested. This is the recurring disease of the Allen file, and it starts with its very first document. Still, the tip demanded action. On October 6, 1971, 3 detectives, John Lynch of Vallejo and Bill Armstrong and Dave Toschi of the San Francisco Police Department, the homicide inspectors who owned the Stine murder, drove to the Union Oil Refinery near Pinole, where Allen was then working, and sat him down in an interview room. Toschi, famous enough that Steve McQueen had borrowed his fast-draw shoulder holster for Bullet, and Hollywood would fold him into Dirty Harry, had interviewed hundreds of suspects. This one he never forgot. Before the detectives had laid out why they were there, Allen brought up the day of the Lake Berryessa attack and volunteered that on that afternoon he had been near the lake. He said he had gone skin diving at Salt Point that weekend, but the detail that froze the room was what he offered next, unprompted: the knives. There were bloody knives in his car, he said, on or around that date. Blood, he explained, came from killing chickens. The detectives had not mentioned knives. The Berryessa attack was a stabbing. Allen also mentioned, in the same conversation, the most dangerous game, the most dangerous animal, the phrase from the cipher offered up casually across the table by a man being questioned about the crimes. Toschi and Armstrong walked out electrified. What they had was a suspect who lived in Vallejo, minutes from 2 crime scenes and the payphone, a fired schoolteacher whose collapse dated to months before the first murder, a marksman and hunter, a man reported by a friend to have scripted the crimes in advance, a man who wore a Zodiac watch, and now a man who had steered his own police interview toward bloody knives and the killer's signature phrase. In December 1971, investigators drew a compass circle on a map. Every confirmed Zodiac crime scene sat within a ring whose logic ran through Vallejo. Allen's house on Fresno Street sat inside all of it. And then the machine hit the wall it would hit for the next 20 years. The physical evidence said no. Allen's fingerprints were taken and compared against the latents from Paul Stine's cab and the Napa payphone. No match. Handwriting exemplars were collected and sent to Sherwood Merrill, the state's premier question documents examiner, the man who had authenticated every Zodiac letter. Merrill's verdict was categorical. Arthur Leigh Allen did not write the Zodiac letters. Not disguised, not with his other hand. Allen was ambidextrous, and samples from both hands were examined. In the forensic hierarchy of 1971, that was close to an acquittal. The letters were the case was the letters, and the state's own expert said Allen's hand never touched them. Detectives who believed in Allen would spend decades arguing around that finding. Perhaps he dictated the letters, perhaps an accomplice wrote them, perhaps handwriting analysis itself was softer science than the era believed. But the file entry read what it read. The suspect everything pointed to was excluded by the evidence that mattered most. He was not, however, cleared. And in September 1972, investigators obtained the first search warrant ever served in the Zodiac case. They went through Allen's trailer in Santa Rosa and his mother's house on Fresno Street, where he lived in the basement. What they found was a portrait, not a proof. Weapons and knives, cryptograph-style materials by some accounts, and details that lodge permanently in investigators' memories. Caged squirrels and chipmunks living in the filthy trailer, and dissected small animals. The pet store employee who loved animals, surrounded by dead ones. Disturbing, suggestive, and legally worthless. No hood, no Stine shirt fragment, no murder weapon matched, no draft of any letter. The searchers walked out of the basement with a deeper conviction and an emptier evidence bag. What prosecutors needed, Allen kept almost giving them, sideways. Over the years, witnesses accumulated like sediment. His own brother, Ron Allen, and Ron's wife Karen eventually cooperated with police, reporting behavior and statements that frightened them. Karen recalled Allen being questioned by his family about the Zodiac crimes and giving answers that reassured no one. Acquaintances reported him making jokes about being the Zodiac, the kind of joke that reads as either gallows humor from a harassed man or the leakage of a secret too heavy to hold entirely shut. Because by the mid-1970s, Allen was a harassed man, and he knew precisely who was harassing him. Vallejo PD surveilled him. He would later tell reporters, with theatrical weariness, that he had been hounded for years for something he didn't do, that the police had ruined his life over a wristwatch. Then, in 1974, the same year the Zodiac letters stopped, Arthur Leigh Allen was arrested for what he actually provably was. He was charged with molesting a young boy, convicted, and committed to Atascadero State Hospital, the state facility for sex offenders, where he remained until 1977. The overlap is the single most cited item in the circumstantial ledger. The Zodiac's correspondence, which had run for 5 years, went silent within months of Allen's confinement. When he was released in 1977, one more letter arrived at the Chronicle. Its authenticity debated ever since, and then the silence became permanent. Coincidence is possible. Coincidence is always possible. But investigators noticed that the killer's voice and Allen's freedom kept the same calendar, and they never stopped noticing. The case ground on through the late 70s and 80s as a file that would not die and would not resolve. Toshi's partner Armstrong transferred out of homicide, worn down. Toski himself was pulled off the case in 1978 amid a scandal. An alleged new Zodiac letter that year was suspected by some of being a fake, and Toski was accused and cleared of having authored fan mail about himself years earlier. The episode scarred the investigation's credibility anyway. Robert Graysmith, the Chronicle's political cartoonist, had meanwhile turned private obsession into public record. His 1986 book Zodiac became a bestseller, reintroduced the case to a new generation, and pointed, under the pseudonym Robert Hall Starr, at a suspect any attentive reader could identify as Arthur Leigh Allen. Allen's neighbors read it. His employers read it. The man had never been charged with a single Zodiac crime, and he was becoming the most famous uncharged suspect in America. The final act of the pursuit began in 1991, 20 years after the refinery interview. Vallejo detective George Bawart, assigned to rework the file, did something nobody had done in 2 decades. He went back to the living witness. Michael Mageau, the survivor of Blue Rock Springs, carrying the bullet scars of July 4, 1969, was shown a photographic lineup. He stopped on position number 1, a 1968 driver's license photo of Arthur Leigh Allen, and identified him as the man who shot him and Darlene Ferrin. His certainty, as documented, was strong. His reliability was instantly attacked. 22 years had passed. The shooting had lasted seconds in darkness behind a blinding light, and eyewitness identification across 2 decades is among the most fragile evidence law knows. But it was enough, combined with the accumulated file, for one more search warrant. In February 1991, police went through Allen's Fresno Street basement again. They carried out pipe bombs, live ones by the account of the search, guns and tapes, and Allen was briefly in genuine legal jeopardy on the explosives. What they did not carry out, once again, was anything tying him physically to the Zodiac crimes. Bawart kept building. By 1992, he had assembled a report cataloguing dozens of points of circumstantial convergence. The watch, the geography, Cheney, the Berryessa weekend admission, the knives, the Atascadero silence, the Mageau identification, the size and appearance matching both survivors' descriptions, the military boot size consistent with prints at Berryessa, the typewriter brand consistent with a suspect document. The Vallejo case, in the view of the men who knew it best, was approaching the threshold where a district attorney might finally be asked the question, charge him? On August 26, 1992, Arthur Leigh Allen was found dead in the Fresno Street house of a heart attack at 58. He had spent his final months telling television cameras he was innocent, a diabetic, ailing recluse insisting to the end that he was a victim of the police, not of coincidence. He was cremated, and with him went every possibility of interrogation, confession, or trial. The case against Arthur Leigh Allen would never be argued before a jury. It would be argued instead before the only 2 tribunals left, the laboratory and the public. In 2002, the laboratory delivered its verdict, and it detonated everything Bawart had built. A partial DNA profile, developed from cells on the adhesive of a Zodiac envelope, was compared to Allen's tissue, preserved from his autopsy. The profile did not match. The announcement made national news as an exoneration. But inside the file, a quieter war broke out over a question the headline skipped. Whose DNA was on that envelope in the first place? And did the Zodiac, a man who wore gloves and taunted forensics, ever lick it at all? The 2002 DNA result deserves to be examined slowly, because it is simultaneously the strongest evidence in the case and the weakest. And which one it is depends entirely on a single assumption nobody can verify. The science itself was sound as far as it went. Working with the San Francisco Police Department, forensic analyst Dr. Sidney Holt developed a partial genetic profile from biological material recovered from a Zodiac envelope, cells presumed to have been deposited by saliva when the sender licked the stamp or flap. Compared against that profile, Arthur Leigh Allen was excluded. So in time were other suspects submitted to the same test. Inspector Kelly Carroll of the SFPD stated it plainly to the San Francisco Chronicle. Arthur Leigh Allen does not match the partial DNA fingerprint developed from bona fide Zodiac letters. Years later, a Vallejo detective would compress the entire post-1992 case into one sentence for the Sacramento Bee. It really comes down to DNA. Without it, you have nothing. But notice what the exclusion actually proves. That the cells on that envelope did not come from Allen. It proves the Zodiac was not Allen only if a second claim is also true. That the cells on that envelope came from the Zodiac. And that claim is an inference, not a finding. The profile was partial, not complete. The envelope had passed through mailrooms, newsrooms, and evidence lockers across 3 decades of pre-DNA era handling, when detectives and clerks touched documents with bare hands, and the killer himself was a demonstrated forensic tactician, a man who wiped down Paul Stine's cab while witnesses watched, whose letters bragged about coating his fingertips, who left no usable prints across 7 attacks and 2 phone calls. Skeptics of the exclusion ask a simple question: does a man that careful lick a stamp? Some investigators believe he moistened stamps with a sponge or tap water. Others note he could simply have had anyone, or no one traceable, handle the envelope. Believers in the exclusion answer with their own simplicity. It is the only physical evidence with genetic content the case possesses, and it says no. Both positions are rational. Neither is provable. And so the DNA, which was supposed to end the argument, instead became the argument. The perfect emblem of a case in which every piece of evidence is a mirror reflecting whatever the viewer already believes. While the laboratory war stalled, the killer's own words gave up their last secret. The 340-character cipher, mailed in November 1969, had resisted the FBI, the NSA's amateur descendants, and 51 years of global effort. In December 2020, it fell, not to an agency, but to 3 private citizens collaborating across 3 continents: David Oranchak, an American software developer; Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician; and Jarl van Eyck, a Belgian warehouse worker and code-breaking savant. Their solution, verified by the FBI, revealed a transposition scheme of genuine sophistication, and a message that managed to be both anticlimactic and chilling. The Zodiac hoped the public was having fun trying to catch him. He was not afraid of the gas chamber, he wrote, because it would send him to paradise all the sooner, because he now had enough slaves to work for him. No name, no confession, no clue. 51 years of humanity's best cryptographic effort, rewarded with one more taunt from a man who was, by then, almost certainly dead. Yet the solve mattered enormously in one respect. It demonstrated that the Zodiac's ciphers were real constructions, not gibberish theatre, the work of a patient, technically capable mind. A mind connoisseurs of the Allen file could not help noting, like that of a man who taught schoolchildren to build codes. And a mind, Allen's defenders replied, like that of 10,000 other hobbyists in 1969 California. The mirror again. Then, in October 2024, the case's center of gravity shifted one last time. Netflix released This Is the Zodiac Speaking, a 3-part documentary built around 2 people who had never before told their story publicly at this scale: David and Connie Seawater. Their claim reframes Allen not as a suspect glimpsed through police files, but as a man they knew intimately, a trusted family friend in the Vallejo of the 1960s, a father figure who took the Seawater children on weekend trips. What they allege, as adults, is documented in their own testimony that Allen drugged them during those years, that decades later, retracing the geography of those childhood trips, they realized they had been taken to the murder sites before the murders, and that Allen confessed to them that the man who helped raise them told them, in effect, who he was. The series stacks their account alongside the case's veterans, Robert Graysmith, now in his 80s, the local reporter who filmed Allen's final interview, former students, friends of the victims. These allegations must be weighed the way everything in this file must be weighed, with both hands. If true, they close the case. They supply the eyewitness proximity, the pre-crime knowledge of locations, and the confession that 50 years of police work never obtained. But they are, formally, the memories of two people recounting events from more than half a century ago, involving childhood experiences allegedly distorted by drugging, told about a man who cannot respond and was never charged. Memory across 50 years is not a recording, it is a reconstruction, and reconstructions bend toward the narratives that surround them. And no narrative has saturated Northern California more completely than Allen's guilt. The Seawater's account is either the missing keystone or the case's final demonstration of how a legend colonizes memory. There is no laboratory for it. There is only the same question John Lynch faced with Donald Chaney in 1971, returned in new clothing. When the only evidence is a human being remembering, what do you do with it? Which brings this case to its final accounting. Not of the evidence, but of what the evidence has done to everyone who touched it. 5 confirmed dead. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stine. 2 survivors who carried the wounds for life. Michael Mageau, whose existence after 1969 became transient and haunted, and Brian Hartnell, who built a career as an attorney and spent decades declining to let the worst afternoon of his life define him. A widow, Claudia Stine, raising children on a doctoral student's memory. Detectives consumed whole. Toshi, who kept victims' photographs in his pocket until he died. Armstrong, who walked away to save himself. Bawart, who built the charging file that death made moot. Graysmith, whose marriage and health were fed into the obsession page by page. And the city itself, a generation of Bay Area school children who remember armed escorts on their bus routes, a fear installed by a few hundred words of felt-tip printing. What does the case reveal about the human mind? 2 things, and they point in opposite directions. About the killer's mind, it reveals that the deepest hunger on display was never bloodlust. The confirmed killing occupied 10 months. The performance occupied 5 years, and arguably continues from beyond the grave. The Zodiac is the purest documented specimen of the murderer as author, a man for whom the crime was a press release and the terror was the product. He understood, before the term existed, that mass media is a weapon that reloads itself, that one threatened school bus, amplified by every front page in a state, outperforms any body count. Every killer who has since sought an audience, every manifesto, every live stream, walks a road the Zodiac paved with 3 envelopes in July 1969. And about our minds, the investigators, the public's, yours, it reveals something more uncomfortable. The unbearable weight of almost. The case against Arthur Leigh Allen is a structure of 40 circumstantial beams with no foundation. The watch, the geography, the timing of his collapse, Chaney's blueprint, the volunteered knives, the most dangerous animal, the Atascadero silence, the survivor's pointing finger, the Seawater's memories. The case for his innocence is 3 laboratory findings standing alone: the handwriting, the fingerprints, the DNA. Each one qualified, each one contested, each one no. Half a century of effort has not moved either pile. If Allen was the Zodiac, then the police identified the right man within 2 years and watched him die free. A failure not of insight, but of proof, the most agonizing kind. If Allen was not the Zodiac, then an entire culture spent 50 years performing the killer's identity onto a convenient monster. A genuinely dangerous, genuinely guilty of other horrors man. But the wrong monster, while the right one lived and died inside the anonymity he killed to advertise. He would have read Graysmith's book. He would have watched the films. He would have seen another man wear his name. The case remains open in 4 jurisdictions. The palm print from the Napa payphone has never been matched. The bloody fingerprints from Paul Stine's cab have never been matched. Somewhere in an evidence locker, the partial profile waits for genealogy techniques that improve every year. The same techniques that unmasked the Golden State Killer in 2018 and could, in principle, end this story with a single database hit. Until then, the Zodiac's last verified words to the world remain the ones decoded in 2020, and they are intolerably fitting. He hoped we were having a good time trying to catch him. 57 years. We are still trying. And the killer nobody could touch, whoever he was, remains exactly what he told us he would be, in the only promise he ever kept: unnamed. If cases like this stay with you the way they stay with us, subscribe. The next case is already on the table, and it goes just as deep.